This is the first of two modules on the topic of regulatory monitoring. Regulatory monitoring may be applicable to rice, fortification inputs, and even foods made with rice, depending on what the legislation stipulates. This form of monitoring is conducted by government inspectors, often from a designated food control authority, with the aim of ensuring that products available to consumers are properly fortified. Regulatory monitoring is broken down into three component parts: external monitoring, import monitoring, and commercial monitoring. In this module, I'll cover external monitoring. External monitoring takes place at rice mills that are expected to fortify. Given the human and financial resources needed to appropriately conduct external monitoring activities, it is most feasible in countries where the rice industry is consolidated. The two components of external monitoring are technical audits and factory inspections, which will be elaborated upon in a moment. Mill personnel should be informed at the start of the fortification program that they will be visited, unannounced, by government inspectors, and will be held accountable for complying with quality assurance, QA, and quality control, QC, protocols, and the specifications of the fortification standard. For this reason, mill personnel should be ready at all times to provide documentation for the procedures that are followed to produce properly fortified rice. The form you see here is used by ardent mills to record information about incoming premix. It can be adapted for use with fortificant blends and fortified kernels too. The frequency of audit and inspection visits is determined by the human and financial resources available within the regulatory agencies, the number of fortification facilities in the country, the type and age of equipment used in the majority of those sites, and the technical capacity of laboratories. Some countries conduct audit and inspection visits monthly, while others with highly automated mills or sophisticated blending facilities and long-standing programs do one audit and inspection visit per site annually. As a general rule, audit and inspection visits should be considered a regular priority in the early years of the program. During a technical audit, inspectors review written quality assurance and quality control protocols and records and observe the rice fortification process in action. This checklist has been adapted from one created for wheat flour fortification in the Solomon Islands. Yes means the mill complies fully. No means there is a problem. Notes should be taken whenever an inspector finds something that does not comply. A copy of this checklist can be found in the Resources section of the module. Many people who just have a general awareness of external monitoring think that the focus should be on collecting and quantitatively testing rice samples. In fact, inspectors should put the largest emphasis on audits. If quality assurance and quality control protocols are in place and well followed, one can be fairly certain that the rice coming from that mill is fortified properly. Inspections, which are more labor-intensive and complex than audits, are a means to verify that all fortified rice complies with the specifications of the country's fortification standard. During an inspection, samples are taken from either the end of the production line or the packaging area, from the warehouse, and from inventory. Samples from the production line or packaging area represent the fortified rice quality of that day, whereas samples from the warehouse and inventory area are indicative of the mill's fortification quality over time. Please note that the following three slides will refer to the production line rather than the packaging area, but the sampling procedures are identical. Prior to obtaining single samples of rice from the end of the production line, the inspector needs to be sure that the feeder is operational and contains fortified kernels. Assuming that is the case, he or she then removes a 250-gram single sample of rice from the end of the production line. This process continues once every 10 minutes until the inspector has accumulated at least 5 single samples. They are each placed in separate containers. In most countries, the qualitative iron spot test determines if those rice samples are indeed fortified. For this, 100 grams of each rice sample is used. The inspector should conduct the iron spot test with the mill's quality control manager observing if possible. Assuming all 5 single rice samples are fortified, the remainder of each, approximately 150 grams, is combined into one composite sample. Unfortified samples are indicated as such on the inspection report. A reason for the failure must be determined. Most large mills or blending facilities have a holding area, or warehouse, where rice is stored briefly until it is shipped for distribution. Assuming such an area exists at the mill, the inspector randomly chooses at least 5 sacks of rice. A 250-gram single sample of rice is obtained from each using a sampling spear. Rice millers should be ready to move rice sacks if requested. A qualitative test is used to verify that the samples are fortified, after which the remainder of each fortified sample will be combined into a single composite sample. If you recall from the internal monitoring module, rice millers prepare and store composite samples on a regular basis. In addition to the samples collected from the production area and the warehouse for external monitoring purposes, the inspector also obtains 3 composite samples chosen at random from inventory. Since the iron spot test was already used on these samples during internal monitoring procedures, it does not need to be conducted again. At the end of the visit, inspectors should have 1 composite sample from the production line or packaging area, 1 composite sample from the mill warehouse, and 3 composite samples taken from inventory. Generally, 5 composite samples are sufficient for pointing out a problem at a rice mill. However, if legal action needs to be taken against a mill, sampling methods should follow Codex Alimentarius, which stands for Food Code. Codex Alimentarius is a set of food standards, guidelines, and codes of practice that aim to increase the safety and quality of food products and fairness among those in the food trade business. Though voluntary, Codex Alimentarius standards often form the foundation for legislation in member countries. You can find relevant information in the references section for this module. The 5 composite samples should each be split into 2 smaller samples. The rice producer should keep one part as a reference. The other part should undergo quantitative testing at a government laboratory. All samples should be labeled with the facility name, type of rice, date of inspection, batch or lot number, and sample number, or ID as given by the inspector. At the end of an audit and inspection visit, the inspector should give a verbal summary of the key findings to the mill manager or other designated individual. Items to discuss include the audit checklist, observations taken during the visit, results from the qualitative analyses, recommendations for improvement, and necessary corrective actions, if required. The inspector is responsible for transporting or shipping the product samples to the designated government or third-party laboratory, as prescribed by the country's monitoring plan, for quantitative analyses. To maximize time and resources, the legislative documents for fortification in most countries stipulate that laboratory employees quantitatively analyze just 1 or 2 marker nutrients. Iron is frequently chosen because it is easier to measure than most other fortificants, and it is added to fortified foods in higher quantities. A written report should be sent to each inspected facility 2 to 4 weeks after an audit and inspection visit. The report needs to include all the items that were explained during the verbal report, plus the results of the quantitative analyses. Additionally, if corrective actions are requested, notification of a follow-up visit should be provided in the report. The results for the tested micronutrients should be close to the target value as indicated by the specifications of the fortification standard, and should fall within the acceptable range of variation. For example, if the standard lists a target value of 35 parts per million for total iron, with a range of 24 to 45 parts per million, then samples that fall within that range are compliant. In this chart, sample number 5 fails to comply. Here is a second example. In this case, all of the samples technically comply with the fortification standard. However, in the written report, authorities may choose to make note of the fact that all iron results were near the low end of the acceptable range of variation. Doing so informs the rice millers that the fortified kernel feed rate should be reviewed and adjusted. As part of the planning process for a fortification program, it is imperative that stakeholders determine and document what criteria must be met for a mill to pass an audit and inspection visit. Here are some criteria to consider. The mill's quality management system indicated that the fortification process is controlled properly. Internal monitoring, QA/QC procedures were documented, appropriately followed, and relevant data were recorded. The facility was actively fortifying rice upon arrival of the inspector, unless the production line was down for maintenance or due to a lack of rice. Inventory of fortified kernels was sufficient to fortify rice for a predetermined amount of time, such as 2 months, or proof of purchase was available. No packages of fortified kernels were expired. 80% of composite samples fulfilled the specifications of the fortification standard. If the mill managers agree with the quantitative test results, the reference samples stored at the mill can now be discarded. However, if the mill managers do not agree with the findings of the analyses, the reference samples can be sent to a reference laboratory for additional testing. In this case, the mill must front the cost. If serious indications of noncompliance, such as a significant over- or under-fortification of micronutrient levels, or other food safety concerns were uncovered as a result of the audit and inspection visit, the product in the warehouse can be held, and production may be temporarily halted. The reasons for such problems require an investigation to pinpoint the causes. Appropriate corrective action steps must be put into place. If less drastic concerns arise during the inspection, a follow-up visit should take place after a reasonable period of time. This gives the producer a chance to implement required corrective actions. During this second visit, the government inspector focuses on those issues that necessitated the extra visit. If the corrective actions have not been executed, the inspector should work with the mill to understand the constraints and problems more thoroughly and assist with reasonable requests for help. Ultimately, however, fines and penalties according to law may be imposed if the site fails to show a commitment to make the required changes. The site should be informed of consequences resulting from persistent noncompliance prior to or when the fortification program commences, and periodically thereafter. Before moving on to the next module, I'd like to draw your attention to one very important side note. A primary role of food inspectors is to monitor parameters in various food products, including rice, whether or not it is fortified. General rice characteristics that are monitored include moisture and broken rice content, among others. Where food control authorities already monitor rice and collect rice samples to test general rice parameters, fortification-specific tasks should be integrated to save on time and costs. For example, existing regulatory monitoring forms and report templates can be adapted to include information about rice fortification. Also, sample volumes can be increased as required to conduct additional analyses relevant to fortification. That concludes the first half of the regulatory monitoring section. Next, import monitoring and commercial monitoring will be discussed.